go away, and I'm everybody's beautiful in the world, right?
Yeah.
Testing. Hello. Oh, hello. Hello, everyone. Welcome. It is just 7:30, so I think we might give it another minute or two, let people kind of join us, but we will begin momentarily. All right. Well, I see no more people at the back milling about, so I think we'll get started. So welcome to those here in person and those online. Welcome to you as well. I'll turn it to Reverend Eric to kick us off.
Thank you, Justine. Good evening, one and all. Welcome to the First Unitarian Congregation of Ottawa. I'm Eric Meter, the lead pastor here. I've been asked to offer a land acknowledgement and then say some words of welcome and introduction. We acknowledge that this congregational campus is located on traditional, unsurrendered, and unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, and that the work of reconciliation is a responsibility of this congregation and of all Canadians. Our goal is to educate ourselves and all those that have the willingness to understand, to be of service to those who are at risk, and to advocate for justice. Tonight, we're here to do some thinking and reflecting on books and reading, namely, to cut to the chase, who can and should have access to what? And at least as importantly, who, if anyone, gets to decide? These are thorny questions, and it may seem odd to some of you that such a conversation is being held in a church. Well, Unitarian Universalists have gone at tradition a bit differently for ages now. Going back to Old English etymology, the word worship means to consider what is worthy, which it seems to me is exactly what we're here to do tonight. Now, if you have either binoculars or very good eyesight, direct your attention to the vertical banner, white text, dark green background. You're going to need a heck of a pair of binoculars. And you'll see there our congregation's covenant that democracy is highlighted as one of our core values. And on the banner just there, you'll see, along with a typo we still have to correct, that we also see it as our responsibility to do all we can to dismantle racism and other systematic barriers to everyone's participation in society. That means both heeding and highlighting voices that have far too long been marginalized. That's the skin we have in this game. And I'm heartened to learn that the Ottawa Public Library's theme for October is democracy. Common cause. Common cause. One last point before we continue. Our topic tonight goes deep into our core understandings and hopes for the society we share. Each of us will have our own understandings and perspectives. Let's respect that and remember to be both generous and kind to one another in all we do and say this evening. Thanks. And again, welcome to First U. Justine?
Okay, thank you very much, Reverend Eric. So welcome, everyone. Very pleased to be here with you this evening. My name is Justine de Jaegher. I've been a congregant at First U since 2018 with my wife, Tara. Very grateful to the organizers of tonight's event, to our panelists, and to all of you for being here. So kind of building off Reverend Eric's discussion there about, why in a church, why a community of faith. I did want to acknowledge our perhaps somewhat unique role as an organized community of faith in this discussion, in living out our principles. It's easy to associate censorship with, totalitarian, sometimes secular governments, but of course, organized religion has played a major role as well in formal intellectual censorship over the ages, from the papal index of prohibited books to Calvinist book burnings of anti-Trinitarian tradition, to Protestant burnings of Quaker literature, of course in Boston, and many examples outside of Christian traditions as well. In addition to that kind of history of organized religion, today many of the organized calls for censorship, and I would say particularly related to the books related to LGBTQ themes, do also have ties to fundamentalist religious groups. And of course, core to our beliefs as you use is both the principle of intellectual freedom and that of religious freedom. And there are some claiming that these freedoms at times present competing claims. We might dispute that. But given that, I think it is a particularly relevant discussion for our congregation. So with that, I will introduce our panelists. I'll actually kind of let each of them introduce themselves in more detail, but we are so grateful to welcome Sonia Bebbington, so the CEO and Chief Librarian of the Ottawa Public Library, and Mick O'Leary of the Frederick Community College, who will be joining us this evening, and then Joanne from the Ottawa Citizen and author of the article By the Book, Ottawa Public Library Takes a Stand on Intellectual Rights, Book Bans, and Cancel Culture, will be joining us for the Q&A component. So I will turn things over to Sonia to kick things off for us.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Justine, and thanks as well to Chuck and to Lisa and everyone who put this together. Happy Library Month. You can feel the fever. I'm delighted to be with you tonight. It's great to be here with Mick and with Joanne. We'll talk about some of the trends across North America, and I'm looking forward to his remarks and to Joanne's comments in the Q&A. So I am the Chief Librarian and Chief Executive Officer of the Ottawa Public Library. I've been a librarian for 26 or 7 years now, the entirety of my career. I'm about to come up on my 1-year anniversary at OPL, and prior to that I was at the Library of Parliament for a period of 12 years. So I'm going to open with some context, understanding that we still have question time to come. And I'll talk about Ottawa Public Library's approach to intellectual freedom. I'll tell you why our statement is important and why you should care about it, what challenges that we are seeing at OPL and increasingly in Canada, and I can touch on some specific experiences. Along the way, I'll address some of the complexity and nuance around intellectual freedom, and if and when necessary, I may delight/bore you with some details on collection management in a public library context, how we build collections and how we manage them and weed them, which is something that we do regularly. So I'll start at home at the Ottawa Public Library. OPL defines intellectual freedom as the free and open exchange of lawful information and ideas in a democratic society, respecting individual rights to privacy and choice. We support information literacy by helping equip clients with the tools to discuss complex topics, to navigate and evaluate information, misinformation, and disinformation, and to encourage critical thinking, all of which are essential tools for an informed and democratic society. The Ottawa Public Library Board, which I may end up calling OPLB at some point, so you know what I mean, approved its revised intellectual freedom position statement in June of 2022. This statement strongly affirms the board's commitment to intellectual freedom in all areas of library service, and it commits to ongoing conversations about free expression. The revised statement on intellectual freedom gives the library very clear context to update all of our policies so that we're really integrating and living intellectual freedom as a core value and will be ready to respond to increasing challenges. So our statement, the policies and our practices reflect intellectual freedom as a core value for us first and foremost, and that's where it starts. And while our position is progressive, it's also founded in law. So very briefly, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, or the Charter, guarantees freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression in Section 2B. We're aligned as well with international codes. So the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 19, states that everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. So as a charter right, intellectual freedom is fundamental. It's not only then logical, but it's in fact a matter of managing our own legal risk for us to have a strong position on intellectual freedom. Further, in the Public Libraries Act of Ontario, access to collections is a core legislated function that we fulfill. Ensuring access to all types of information and perspectives as part of our offering is essential. It means that we're fulfilling our mandate. It means that we're doing so in line with our own values, with all applicable legislation, and in line with your rights. And in building our collections, we seek to represent multiple viewpoints and experiences and to ensure a balance of perspectives. Ottawans can read freely and form their own opinions informed by many points of view. And so we build that diverse collection with lots of different viewpoints. We do so on professional guidelines, which is our content services framework or collection development policy, but that's about collection building. So what about removing? Well, as a matter of collection management, a public library weeds material all the time. And I like to think of the collection as sort of a rolling window, today's date, and we just keep going forward through time with a large window of current popular fiction, nonfiction, and with a long, narrowing tail of things that we might retain for longer periods of time, so some classics, things like that. If we look at that current and retained content, specifically when we receive a request to reconsider one of the items, again, we find our foundation in the law. The Criminal Code describes areas such as hate, where freedom of expression can be limited. In essence, for an item to be removed from the collection, it needs to meet that legal definition of hate, and it would have to be identified as such by the courts. Only the courts can abridge free expression in Canada. Hate speech is a complex area of the law, and expressions of hatred are acceptable. The legal limit really involves material which explicitly incites people towards a likely breach of the peace. In other words, the threshold for establishing hate is set very high. Other illegal content would include child pornography, and this is the language that we encounter when we receive objections to books which deal with sexual development, sexual orientation, and diversity of gender identity and expression, particularly books on those topics that are meant for younger audiences. However, the definition of child pornography in Canadian law relates to work depicting or counseling sex with a minor, but excludes any work intended for art or education. So those are the sort of foundations of our statement. Why is this position important? Well, first of all, it protects you. It protects the things that you might want to read and have access to, and it prevents anyone else from limiting your access based on their values. Those might be other members of the public, but what we'll likely hear from Mick about the situation in the US, these people could also be political actors, indeed politicians themselves, and I must put a caveat here, that has not been the experience at Ottawa Public Library, very, very much supported in this work by the board and council. Publicly, a strong statement also lets everybody know the deal. It makes our values transparent. It makes our positioning and our process to defend items in moments of challenge very clear, and no matter where those challenges might come. An uncensorable source for information and ideas is not only individually valuable, but societally and democratically valuable. Intellectual freedom protects libraries as well. And finally, in practice, but also in principle, the value of a strong position on intellectual freedom is clear when you use it to defend against specific requests for reconsideration. But the true and sustained value is that you have stood against and defeated censorship, because censorship presents a far greater and longer-lasting risk than that posed by any item in the collection. So I've spoken about challenges. What kinds of challenges are we seeing? I mentioned that for OPL, intellectual freedom is about collections, but it also, in fact, applies to programs, displays, meeting room rentals, and internet access. We collect materials according to professional guidelines, and I described that sort of large rolling window and long tail. And individuals who object to materials in the collection can discuss their concerns with a member of staff, or they can fill out a request for reconsideration of library material. That's our formal process. Last year, we received 17 formal requests for reconsideration. This number is slightly lower than the previous year, which I think was a record at 25 requests, but it remains higher than the average in the last decade of approximately 6 requests annually. The concerns raised about these books, which were from all over in the collection, books for kids, books for adults, included racist language and images, cultural appropriation, ableism, anti-Islamism, LGBTQ content inappropriate for children, and political propaganda. As of 2023, we have 6 requests for reconsideration for largely similar reasons. Typically, requests for reconsideration are submitted individually, meaning that an individual will identify an item that they take issue with, but there are increasingly organized attempts to censor materials and to do so on a very broad scale. In my time at OPL, I have received one form letter which looked to emanate from Action for Canada, which is one of the groups operating in this field. And the letter had a very legalese type of wording and indicated that I would be the subject of legal action on the basis of distributing child pornography if I did not remove all books listed in their attachment within X number of days of having received their letter. This was not, of course, legally valid, but you have to note the tactic, threatening individual legal action. And given some of the stories from the US that I'm familiar with, this is a tactic that could really scare people. I've also received one unsigned letter addressed to me personally, which warned me about harming children and said that a defund the library movement was gaining momentum. When we're looking at individual requests for reconsideration, it's very, very important to respond thoroughly and respectfully. Most people who take the time to submit such a request do so because of deeply held personal beliefs. Perhaps they're religious beliefs, perhaps they're based on personal experience, and those conversations are usually always already emotional. And while we're firm on intellectual freedom, answering with a simple no would be very dismissive or flippant. Making space for the conversation, sharing the context of our work and the process of our decision-making is very important. And all individuals, no matter their perspective, deserve this thorough and thoughtful and respectful response. In the face of larger anonymous campaigns like that of Action for Canada, we answer a little bit differently, but I can get into that perhaps in the Q&A. So that describes some of the challenges that we've seen. And it's a complex area. Freedom of expression is a very priceless right, and it has historically protected voices, perspectives, and content that has been marginalized. But let me be very, very clear. Intellectual freedom also protects content that some will find offensive. We can't be selective in our commitment to intellectual freedom, and we must understand that a principled approach to intellectual freedom will defend, in the very same way and on the very same logic, both sides of any issue. I'll also observe that it's very easy to get into a debate on the item or the issue in question, or whether or not the perspective that's expressed in a work is legitimate. But that is a very different conversation entirely from that of intellectual freedom. And I do this a lot because I think about intellectual freedom as an umbrella that protects all of the different pieces of content under it, and some of them are diametrically opposed. It's an image in my head, and my hands will move in that direction, just so you understand the signs. And intellectual freedom defends an item's right to be in our collection, or a speaker's right to speak, or a program's right to exist. It doesn't defend the ideas or perspectives expressed there. So it's essentially content agnostic. So it can be a very difficult area. So the OPL also has book lists, resources, and programs to support clients navigating diverse opinions in our collections, even in the news, resources on how to discuss challenging topics with kids. And information literacy and the ability to evaluate information and think critically are also very important, and it's another part of our role to support clients in developing those skills. So as I've just described, practicing intellectual freedom can be, in individual moments, uncomfortable. However, the alternative of censorship is a greater risk, and it doesn't solve any actual social problems. A bad idea doesn't go away because a book has been weeded. In fact, censorship can drive ideas underground, and it can even create free speech martyrs out of someone that you might find odious. Also, who we are is expressed in publishing. Dr. Emily Knox, who's from the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois, talked about this. She talked about reading Agatha Christie, including when characters made very casual racist or classist remarks, because it gives an understanding of how those ideas are so enmeshed in everyday conversation and in society at the time. Censorship can also fossilize our ability to exercise the mental muscles that we need to debate and to engage critically with opinions, to explore the roots of the ideas and to expose their weaknesses, and it can divert attention from the real solutions. So I'll close on what you can do to help. Number one, get a library card and use it regularly. It's a great way to show your support for OPL, but also for what libraries do and stand for more generally. I also recommend occasionally reading something that you might not agree with. Sometimes you have to work to get out of the echo chamber. Expose yourself to those ideas and decide for yourself how you feel about different topics. Start the conversation about difficult topics with young people in your life early. We've got tools for support. There are even books in our collection to support you having potentially awkward family conversations over Thanksgiving dinner, which is coming up. And get involved in Canadian Library Month. We have programs going on all month. And I'll mention that on Thursday, October 19th, we have an event with Daniel Dale, who is a renowned fact checker for CNN, and he'll speak about discerning fact from fiction, which is another important element of information literacy in this broader discussion about an informed citizenry and democracy. I hope to see you there. Until then, I know that we have a lot to talk about tonight, and I'm looking forward to it. So I'll end my opener there, and I'll hand it over to Mick. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Mick O'Leary, and my lovely wife Jan and I, are delighted to be here. And we also want to thank our gracious hosts, Lynn and Chuck, who've just treated us royally. Chuck and I were in college together, and a while ago, we just happened to be talking about this subject and found that we each had a strong interest in it. And then a little bit later, Chuck mentioned this event and said, maybe would you consider participating? And I said, this sounds like a very good, important venue. So here we are. And coincidentally, this is the second time we've been in Canada in the past couple of months. In August, Jan and I took an excursion ship tour up in the Northwest Passage, which is a glorious, beautiful place, and we had a wonderful time, learned a lot. For example, the largest territory in Canada by size has the smallest population. And the reason for this is that Canadians want none of it. But when I was thinking about what we might discuss, I said, this is a Canadian audience, and I thought, I wonder if what's going on in Canada. Are there book banning movements in Canada? So I spent some time looking into this, and I relied upon two sources for data on the American situation. I used information from the American Library Association, which has been tracking this for over 20 years. And in Canada, the Center for Free Expression, you may have heard of that, has, for the past few years, been developing a database called Library Challenge Database, which documents individual complaints or requests for removal for books among Canadian public libraries. And I've spent quite a bit of time looking there to see, well, I wonder if are there patterns, are there similarities? And, well, we'll take a look and see what we might find. One big disclaimer on this, both of these databases is very far from comprehensive or complete. The ALA database states that it thinks the number of actual book banning attempts is far larger than what they have documented in the database. And in the Canadian database, there are 42 libraries reporting. They report records that describe these individual attempts. And there are over 600 public libraries in Canada. So these statistics at all point, we just have to be very tentative about them and think the actual picture is quite a bit larger. I myself don't think it's a lot different, but we'll have to be cautious because it is a small sample. Now, if I could get slide up here. Okay, one. Next one. And next one. Okay. We have, yes, we have slides, but there's only 4 of them, and they have big letters. First of all, we look at data on the number of challenges in Canadian by the two databases over the past 5 years. Now, if you look up here, you see, if you go compare the two countries, there's a very strong pattern. And the pattern corresponds to another pattern between the two countries. Any guesses? If you look at the number of Canadian challenges, it's about 1/10, very roughly 1/10 those of American libraries, which corresponds very roughly to the respective populations of the two countries. So that at least indicated tentatively to me that America is not the only place where book banning is occurring. Now, if we take a look from the top down, over that 5-year period, another very strong pattern emerges, very, very startling. So let's take a look here. And you look over here for the first, let's say these 3, and you average those, they're pretty close. And then you look at the next following 2 years, 2021, 2022. What happened? Multiplications over each of those 2 years. Each year was a multiplication of the other. From 61 to 125, from 10 to 61. And then very similarly in the US, you're cruising along around 200 or so per year, and then bam, it triples and then almost doubles from here to here. And the startling increases. The explanation that I find very informative is that this period here corresponded to the closure of schools because of COVID, which means that in both countries, schools were closed largely, parents were at home, children were at home with their lessons, and they're learning online or trying to learn online. That's very difficult, especially for the younger kids. So parents were seeing much more closely than previously just what their students were learning. And some percentage of these parents were shocked to find out what type of unacceptable content to which their kids are being exposed. And a smaller percentage of those folks decided to become active and started forming book banning groups or individuals, leading to these drastic increases in the numbers of book banning attempts that have had over that 2-year period. And the data on 2023, some of that is in these databases, shows that they're still continuing at a very high rate of increase. So it certainly doesn't appear that this is crested, at least not any time yet, so we don't know. But this is quite a major increase in just a few years. Now, what type of books are these folks complaining about? Which ones do they want removed or taken out or moved somewhere? So let's go to the next slide. This information is from the Library Challenges database. And I will just take my word for it. The reasons, the rationales for asking that a book be removed are comparable to those in the United States. What this reason A for complaint, the Library Challenges database is very full of information that describes the book, the class of the complainant, the reasons. There are 2 categories. You can give more than one reason. Reason A is the first reason, which I took to mean the most important one for them, and there's other information. Now, if you look at the top 3, these 4 these are the number of complaints. You can see that they cluster again. A very large number of complaints are for age inappropriate, pro-LGBTQ 1A2S explicit content, and then objectionable content. There's a lot of overlap in those. This one can be the same. A lot of these books discuss, a lot of it are focused around issues of sex, sexuality, gender identity, and race. And a given book may have discussed all of those, so they are mixed together. But it really shows that the book banners are really focused on these issues. And there's another factor that occurs to me. These books have been in libraries for quite a few years. Books on homosexuality, that has been an issue, for a publicly discussed issue in both countries for many years now. But the one new element, perhaps, that has emerged much more recently, I think, is this whole question of gender identity, including trans and intersex. And this launches a whole set of fears about boys going into girls' restrooms and this sort of thing. So that's why I think, if you look, we will take a look at a list of the books in just a few minutes. A lot of them deal with this and say that, well, this is explicit content in this book on this topic. this is objectionable content in this book, and this is age inappropriate. Now, with respect to the last one, I think the biggest disinformation coming out of the book banning movement is that somehow pornographic books are being pushed into the hands of little children. Now, if you're talking about school libraries, or you've got children, means any individuals anywhere from 6 to 18. And there's quite a variation in that range. And if you do go into a public library or a school library, you will see that all of the books are not bundled up together. We have adult section, we have young adult section, we have children's sections, and they're all apart. So the likelihood of finding a book on sexuality, let us say, that was suitable for an 11th grader, you'll have no more luck finding a book like that in an elementary school library than you will a calculus textbook. Because the way libraries are set up, it's very conscientious and very attentive to what is appropriate and suitable and good for the audience. And we have multiple audiences. But there is this notion that they don't say that, they say, well, pornographically children. So but you hear that message coming from them quite a bit. Okay, let's take a look at another interesting pattern. And I will say that this pattern also prevails across the United States. But the book banning is not, it's widely dispersed, it's sporadic, and it occurs differently in different locations. A lot depends. You typically need some individual or some small group that really feels that something has to be done to get these books out of the library, and that doesn't occur everywhere. So, for example, Edmonton, there's 143 complaints. That's the largest number for a given library system. And Edmonton is a big city, 1.5 million people. Ottawa PL, according to the database, has 123 and 1.1 million. So that seems to be roughly in proportion between those two cities in terms of the number of complaints. But down here, Toronto has 95. But it is 4 times larger than Edmonton and 6 times larger than Ottawa. But many fewer complaints based upon the database. Now, this is, as I say, these data are, we need to be cautious about them, and there may be fewer, not so many reports from Toronto, but just based upon the data that we have, it's highly erratic. You can't just say, big city, many complaints, small town, few complaints. It can be completely different. In the United States, the New York City has fewer book banning complaints than the city of York, Pennsylvania, 100 miles to the south, which is about 200,000 people. There's an extremely frantic book banning movement in York, Pennsylvania. And lastly, I put this within just to, now the Red Deer Public Library is roughly halfway between Calgary and Edmonton. And it had 41. Its population is about 100,000. So again, there is, it looks like there's a particularly active group in the smaller community, the smaller library. So it shows that it's very idiosyncratic as far as where these things occur. And next slide. This one, I've thought about this one a lot, trying to see what these patterns indicate here. This, over here on the left, let's see, every year the American Library Association puts out a list of the 10 most commonly challenged books. And for 22, it had 13 because there were some ties. Now, if you look at this list, even from the titles, but if you look at them, a large number of these prominently feature the LGBTQ themes. A large number of them also deal with sexuality. And you can see, so that demonstrates again how much the book banning movement has focused on those topics that we mentioned a couple slides ago. Now, here's where it starts to get interesting. Again, these are United States. The Library Challenge database doesn't list any of these titles. I looked each one up, it wasn't there. Then I said, well, maybe Canada doesn't have any of these books. So I said, I'll go back to Edmonton. That's where they had the largest number of complaints. Every one of these books is in Edmonton Public Library. So that suggests at least that, yes, Canadian libraries do have these books. And so how do you explain that? And I have a theory about what that is. It's just mine. It's not something that's documented anywhere. And the book banning, my conclusion on this is the book banning movement in the United States is much more organized, much more connected and coherent than in Canada. The principal driver of the book banning movement in the United States is a group called Moms for Liberty. Has anyone heard about that? It's a group started by a couple mothers in Florida just because of these school curriculum and library issues, and they've spread across the country. There's over 55 chapters all across the United States. They're very well organized. The head office has training materials for the members. They have guidelines. How do you mount a book-bound attack? What are the legal issues? How do you publicize these things? And they produce a list of books that they have deemed inappropriate. It's about 500 books covering all topics, but particularly these same topics that are represented in these books. And so in the United States, if you want to have a book banning movement in your community, you don't have to go into the library and study all the shelves and say, oh, this one. You've got you have a turnkey collection of books to attack. All you have to do is just check to see which titles are in your library. A lot of them will be, and then the database that the Moms for Liberty has assembled is called booklooks.org. You can write that down, remember that. It's very interesting to go in and see how it works. It not only identifies the book, it has excerpts of the naughty parts, full text export of the naughty parts, so you don't even have to go and read the book. Some of these books are, my goodness, 150 pages long. But you've got the act, and then you can go into your school board meeting and say, well, this book has, and you read these things, and then everybody's startled. But so the logistics of doing book banning in the United States, I think, are very different than in Canada. Moms for Liberty appears to be a United States operation. They don't list any chapters outside of the United States. I didn't see any indication of large-scale connections between Moms for Liberty and Canadian groups. The only thing I could find, I didn't try to be comprehensive on this, there's a group called Action for Canada. Has anyone heard of Action for Canada? Action for Canada is an activist group for a lot of what would you call, conservative or whatever the term is, interests. And I've seen some indications that they've been nudging some book banning. If you go to the Action for Canada website, they list what their principal areas of interest are. They don't list book banning. So what my conclusion is that these challenges from Canadians are there, but they just may not be hitting these books. If you scan through the Library Challenge database, you will see very large numbers of books dealing with the themes we mentioned, as we saw, but maybe they're just not, they're finding other books, and they don't know about booklooks.org, so they don't have this thing, this turnkey operation ready to go. So that's not to say, so you can see that, at least it seems to me, there's a lot of similarities in what's happening in book banning between our two countries, and the trend lines, I think, seem to be following. I guess the one thing I'd mention is that if you're concerned about book banning, it might be interesting to see, or concerning to see, if the Canadian book banning local groups begin to get organized and therefore empowered in the way that is happening in the U.S. So that's, I think we have to be, as I say, thinking that these things are not going away. So we just have to continue to be prepared so that as librarians, we can present the response. It's a reasoned, thoughtful response that gives full opportunity for the complaint and a full hearing of it. Just one last thing. I didn't put this on the slideshow, but if you look in the Canadian database, or library challenges, it gives you an idea what finally happened to the complaint. And it includes, as Sonia mentioned, not only books, but displays, programs, etc. And I'd say, this is guesstimate, at least 90% of the complaints are not acted upon. In a small number, the books may be moved to a different, let's say from a middle school to a high school or something like that. But in vast majority of the cases, the book banning complaint is not successful. So thanks to you folks who are actually doing this out there with all the work that it entails. As Sonia was mentioning, this is a time-consuming process. And if you get a deluge with these things, it's a big deal. So thank you very much. And keep your eyes open because the book banners are, they're still out there. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to turn to some discussion, some Q&A. Joanne, did you want to join us now here? That's great. And maybe while you come up here, Sonia, you were going to speak a bit to the Canadian database. You had and the list.
Yeah, so I mentioned individual complaints, and then I mentioned as well these sort of blanket anonymous complaints. So I did in my opening remarks say we received one of those. It's very likely that all of the books on that list were on the attachment that I was meant to go through and expunge from the collection. But when we receive an anonymous sort of blanket approach like that, we write back and ask the person to submit individual requests for reconsideration for each of those items, and that just didn't happen. So it's possible that in that blanket sense, some of those books were identified to us, but our response in those instances is to request that people take the time and go through and submit item by item. If they had done so, they would have appeared there, but that tends to be our approach with those kinds of requests.
Great, thank you. Joanne, did you want to introduce yourself perhaps and your interest in the topic a little bit before we move to some questions? Or whatever you want to say.
Hi, I'm Joanne Lossius. I'm a reporter at the Ottawa Citizen, and I did a piece about the new policy after I read about it in one of those City Hall agendas, and I was sort of curious in terms of what requests for reconsideration had been made at the Ottawa Public Library and whether the requests were up or down, and to report a little bit more about the policy and what was groundbreaking about it in Canada.
Great, thank you. So I'll kick things off with a question or two, but we are very strongly encouraging if there are questions from the audience, if folks want to ideally come up, I believe, to the microphone here. You can ask those in person, and then Chuck is also monitoring the online chatter, which may be interesting, and may have some comments from the online chatter as well. But to kick things off, so, I mentioned in my little introduction, book banning is not a new concept. It has existed since, the written word itself. But is there something unique about the present moment? Is there something that's different about the calls for bans now that we ought to be paying attention to? And similarly, are there things that perhaps aren't so different that we also ought to be paying attention to? Not sure who would like to start. To the panel. Sure.
So definitely there's a rise in volume, an increased volume, and different formats for the challenges. Also, that level of organization that we've spoken to has changed quite a bit. Some groups are using information to sway the opinions and try to influence people to launch their own, individual requests. And, in terms of what you were talking about, Moms for Liberty, while, I haven't followed the money on this, so I don't know the connection between them and Action for Canada or Concerned Parents, which is another such group here in Canada. But there are exactly those sorts of primers and YouTube videos about how to do this. So certainly there is an influence that's happening across the border, and social media allows for exactly those excerpts that you're talking about to get taken out of the context of a book, out of the context of what collection it's in, out of its educational context, and allows things to get circulated without the context that grounds it, and allows that sort of furor to get whipped up. So I think that's part of the difference that we're perceiving.
I would speculate that I think that the pandemic gave people a little bit of time to be alone and a little bit of time to spend more time online, exchanging ideas and, as you say, developing those sort of relationships, and which are not necessarily local. They can cross jurisdictions, and to share these strategies for attempting to ban books. I feel that the pandemic was likely a bit of a ignition for that.
As far as another parallel, at least in the United States, the right-wing conservative Republicans have made a very successful attempt for years to work at lower levels of government, school boards, city councils, county commissioners, seeing that rather than talking to a congressperson and seeing it work down, it's instead of trickle down, it's trickle up. You can't trickle up, can you? And so perhaps these movements to attack school curricula and school and library book collections excuse me, mirrors that, in that they're not going to the Library of Congress and saying, well, get rid of all these books. They're going right in their own communities, and at times, even though they're not getting many books moved out, they're causing a lot of concern, and it's just putting just a bad environment on the whole topic.
Thank you. Chuck, do we have a question from online? No, just getting ready. Oh, okay. We've got a roving mic. That's very exciting. Okay, I'll maybe pose one more question, and then, if you want to, I think we've got a question over here, Andrew, and then a question over here as well. I was wondering, a question that arose for me as you were both speaking was, and perhaps this isn't a huge phenomenon, but beyond, there are existing collections, and then people make complaints or request that items be removed. In the current climate of an increased, increased climate of requesting that books be removed, of perhaps online harassment in some cases for having included books in collection in the first place. Is there, either anecdotally or is there evidence for any kind of almost self-censorship or incentive to not include items in the first place in collections either in Canada or the United States, right? Is there any move to kind of, or do you have any sense that there's, you know, well, we just won't feature these things in the first place, we know they'll be controversial, or perhaps the opposite, is there more of an incentive? Not sure if there's any evidence to that fact or any anecdotal kind of pieces you'd like to share, but curious about that.
That's the importance of a collection development policy that lays out what are the principles by which you collect, and anything that would meet that criteria would be eligible to be collected. So we wouldn't sort of preemptively remove somebody's access to something. And we do strive for balance. So, you know, if we're retaining in the collection something that is perceived, for example, to be anti-trans, we would want to ensure to include a balance in the collection and make sure there's lots of queer positive and trans positive material in the collection to provide that. So it really is about having a well-founded professional set of guidelines around collection development that talk about subject areas, things like the perceived demand for an item, and you know, the subject areas that we tend to collect in, again, largely popular fiction, nonfiction. But not exclusively. And we're not a national library. We're not going to collect everything that's published either. So it really has to meet those guidelines. So I would say it's really about that, and it's not about, you know, preemptively avoiding a certain topic area.
I've read a number of anecdotal reports about librarians who felt a chilling effect in that they see this environment and maybe not even consciously or certainly not willingly have maybe pulled back a little bit in terms of how they're presenting and acquiring information. And then in a number of our states, there is legislation that could potentially lead to librarians being arrested and incriminated for in some vague way distributing this kind of information. And that, I think, I would find that a very chilling prospect of going to jail for being a librarian. We're fortunate, though, in Ottawa that those sorts of, at the legislative level, aren't terribly common. We haven't seen a lot of that. It tends to be more those one-to-one, and like I said, our experience is more at that level where there is sort of that immediately emotional conversation, and we've been very fortunate that we haven't seen that level of attack.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
I find it ironic that a group that bans books, and my name is Andrew, I find it ironic that a book that is trying to ban books calls itself Moms for Liberty. That was weird. I'm curious to know if a book does get removed from circulation or moved to a different part of a collection, is that something that's done quietly behind the scenes, or is it publicized so that the general public knows this has actually happened and can counter it if they don't agree?
Our practice, so I'll say two things on that because it's an important point. We don't prevent, a school library might, but a public library doesn't prevent someone who is a child from browsing the adult section or other sections of the library. So we don't do that sort of preventive work by section. We try to build the sections for convenience so that, you know, you're in sort of your audience, your age range, and that's a convenient thing. But we don't prevent, you know, kids from going to older sections to look for content. So that's one element. The second element I was going to mention is, and I've lost my train of thought. We're very public about now because we have this new intellectual freedom statement, and you know, Joanne was responding to our the report that we put out at the February board meeting. February has Freedom to Read Week there. And we mark that by putting out our challenges report. So we're very transparent about what titles have been challenged and what the decision was. And again, it's, you know, we want to be retaining those items. If something gets moved, it would appear in that report. So we try to be transparent about it.
There's another question back here.
Hi, my name's Barbara Lucas. I was very intrigued by two of Mick's slides. The first one was that listed violence and the other characteristics that would get people to request that a book be banned. So that was slide number one. Then I tried to match it with the slide that listed the actual books. So Mick, what is an objection? What objection is there to looking for Alaska? Like, what the heck?
I think that particular book was challenged because of gender identity discussions.
In Alaska, or looking for Alaska?
Well, that was just the title, but the book itself, that I think was the reason against, the complaints were lodged against that one.
It's more conviction than,
Oh, there you go. Alaska could have been the name of somebody, yeah.
Yes, it's a work of fiction.
Just want to say, obviously, thank you to the panelists. I do not consider myself at all to be knowledgeable on this topic, and I've learned an incredible amount over the last hour with you. So thank you so much and I'm struggling with the vocabulary. I'm struggling trying to understand the full dimensions of this issue. And I do want to mention there was an article that some of you may have seen in the New York Times on Saturday. Margaret Renkel wrote this article, and it was essentially about book banning. And it was a deeply moving article, so I can recommend that to some in the audience who want to further develop their knowledge and understanding. I found in the article a curious reference, and I'm just grateful if you have any observations on it. And I don't expect you to have any, so if it's not possible, it's not possible. But I'll just read the quotation. When the Washington Post analyzed 986 complaints against specific books filed during the 2021 school year, it found that a majority were issued by the same 11 people. Yes, 11 people, okay? And that's what it says here too. You read it right, 11 people. So there's part of me that is deeply suspicious. My wife always reproaches me for my excessive suspicion, but these may be dummy names through which the complaint has been funneled to protect the identities and the anonymity of those who are actually doing the hard work of pulling together these complaints. I don't know, but any thoughts on what might be going on? And is in fact the complaining group, for example, in the United States, really that small?
I think you're exactly right. There are cases where one individual is the front person, if you will, and there are numerous people who actually fill out the individual complaint forms, and maybe they don't want to have their names publicized, but then the lead, the front person's name is attached to that. So we have had discussions of that method. Speaking of newspaper articles, Joanne, your article appeared on the Ottawa PL
Sorry, in the
yeah, when did your article appear?
June, I believe.
June.
Yeah.
Well, Joanne did an excellent article on the the Ottawa situation, describing the incident and the subsequent steps. So you can easily look that up on the newspaper website.
I think that my observation is that also speaks to the level of organization that's happening in those requests, because you would see, obviously you'd see far more people and probably a larger range of titles if this were just about individual requests, but because of the sort of organized and form letter nature, it becomes very easy to do that. And there's an interesting element here, and Alex might not be very happy that I'm talking about this, but when I look at a request for reconsideration, I'm very curious if the person is actually a cardholder of the Ottawa Public Library or a resident of Ottawa, and that means something to me because it takes a lot of time and it takes emotional energy sometimes to respond to these requests for reconsideration. And I consider I want to do that in the context of a relationship. But if I feel like I'm getting a form letter from, somewhere else in Canada, I'm not feeling that responsibility to that relationship. And I take that relationship with residents and with cardholders very, very seriously. And so that's why our response to those form letters is please submit this, and then we can figure out if the person is a cardholder or a resident, and I do want to maintain those relationships at that individual level. But I think that's speaking to that level of organization, that sort of form approach.
And I think too in the in school boards and in municipal politics, I think this threat of legal action, I think, can be very potent too.
Yeah.
And I think you're probably seeing it more often than you have in the past.
Yes.
Yeah, if I can just jump in on that, speaking of, nefarious, perhaps online activity. I was hoping folks could speak a bit to kind of the personal toll, perhaps, that it takes on librarians, concerned citizens, researchers, journalists, defenders of intellectual freedoms. I imagine we could plot similar increases to the request for book bans to kind of forms of kind of online harassment, threats of legal action, et cetera. And, this becomes ultimately, in some ways, a workplace health and safety issue for, frontline librarians, educators, et cetera. I'm just wondering, either speak to your own experiences or anecdotally, those around you, just kind of the personal toll it is taking to speak out in defense of this principle. And perhaps particularly when you're speaking out in defense of the principle when the content in question is something that you might abhor, that you might think is absolutely personally objectionable. That was a big one. If anyone wants to take a crack.
That's a Sonia question.
Okay. Sure. So I can speak for the experience as a library professional, and I want to preface by saying we feel very, very fortunate at Ottawa Public Library. We have full support of the board and council. And there is pressure on library CEOs who often will face the brunt of media attention. Now, that's not been an issue again here, but my colleague Vickery in Toronto very publicly was in the press about hosting Megan Murphy, a speaker who's perceived to be anti-trans, and the staff at the branch hosting the event, faced a lot of harassment around that, and it damaged some relationships with the community. I think it can be really generally difficult to feel like you constantly you're getting these things that you have to sort of re-justify libraries, which are generally seen as a public good, and there's emotional labor in that, especially if perhaps someone identifies with a community that's under attack, and that's really evident in the request for reconsideration. So there's definitely some emotional labor there. We have a team who will respond to these things, so that burden certainly can be shared. I think it can be, again, there is that potential for a core value conflict, but we really try to support staff in talking about intellectual, freedom in a way that is, inclusive. It feels in that instance, and defending that item, it doesn't feel terribly inclusive. But if you're practicing intellectual freedom well, it is very much an inclusive concept, and that and inclusion don't have to be in opposition, and they can really work in tandem. We look at our security practices. If there is a high-risk event, we would consider what we might need to put in place for that. And we have a peer support network for employees, not just for intellectual freedom type of conversations, but for some of the other things that happen in a very public frontline type of work. So those are some of the supports that we try to put in place. But it is an instance of some of that emotional labor sometimes that is part of the work.
Either of you want to add? No? Right.
Well, I have to agree that the emotional labor part of it is very difficult, and it's one reason why I have a Twitter account, why I haven't tweeted in some time. To be a journalist is to be sort of somewhat of a public figure, and I really don't like to look sometimes on the kinds of comments and reactions I've had to things that I've written. It does, as Sonia says, basically require you to put that emotional labor into it, which was, I think, probably not part of the job, previously.
You feel, I've had conversations with members of staff who are in exactly that position, put in the position of defending something that, questions their identity. And it's a terrible feeling, because I feel like such a robot, because I'm talking about the principle. Meanwhile, someone, might feel like their identity is being kicked around, or someone else might feel like their views aren't being represented. And that's a different level of emotion than the thing that I'm talking about. But, it has happened that in the course of that conversation, the principle of protecting everybody's right to speak, every idea's right to exist, even if it's terrible, like that too can become deeply emotional. When you get right down to it, intellectual freedom supports democracy. Democracy is part of, social cohesion, our ability to speak to each other. So I do try to connect, that passion and that emotion to this defense, while never losing sight of that sort of individual. And I don't mean to be pejorative and talk about it as if it's narrower, but never lose sight of that. And that's why even a request for reconsideration from the public, someone I've never met, do try to respond to it in terms of a relationship, and I think that's really important.
Yes, please. Audience question.
Thank you, everyone. This has been fascinating. My name is David, and I was a city councillor for 8 years, and so, Joanne, I understand fully why you wouldn't have a Twitter account. My 8 years in office, I did not have a Twitter account, and oddly enough, I then published a novel and had a Twitter account, and there have been days when I regret it and take a break from it. That's a bit of a tangent, but only a bit of one.
David, I want to tell you, it's a million times worse now than it was.
Yes, it absolutely is. So interestingly, the main character in my novel, her name is Simone Cohen, and she is, as you gather from the name, a female journalist with a Jewish last name. And she has a line in the book where she says, so just imagine you're not only a journalist, you're a female journalist, and you've got a Jewish last name, in terms of the hate, the stuff you have to put up with. This gets to the question of a point I wanted to make, or response, really, any thoughts that you have on self-censorship. That's come up here, the idea of chill. I'm thinking it particularly from the author's perspective, but that it ripples from library, bookstore, publishing house, author, all the way down. As I was going through my manuscript, different versions, with an editor and with readers, I would get feedback about appropriate words to use and things that I might want to phrase differently. And it was very valuable. In some cases I said, no, it's how I wanted to say it. And others said, thank you, that's very helpful. I wasn't trying to insult, provoke in this particular case, so that's useful that I now know that that's not a word that I should be using, or in some cases should we should no longer be using. And just in The Guardian today, Ian McEwan, who has published many more books than I and many more readers than I, he made the comment that no, he has never gone to a sensitivity reader, and he doesn't even understand this idea of a sensitivity reader, that he worries that authors should be writing from feeling and from their own sense of the story they need to tell from their own point of view. And when you start to then feel like you can't say it, understandably, not going out of your way to be hateful, but that you have to be able to be honest in your own story, and that can come from wherever you are on the political spectrum. And so I guess what I'm wondering is, in what way do you feel that finds its way to your work in libraries, that I suppose it's throughout publishing and literature, that we all in our own way have to judge, do I need to say this? Do I need to see it this way? But the fear that, and here it's come as much, my editor said to me, David, this is a very bad time to be publishing in Canada. And I said, really? What? I assumed she was talking about all the publishing houses are folding or being merged. She said, no, actually. And it's the first time I'd heard the term woke. She said, there are things that you just can't say anymore. And you, a white middle-class guy, should not speak in the voice of anyone other than you. And it was the first time I'd really encountered that. And I thought, oh, is that where we're at in writing now, where I'm not even middle-aged anymore, a white guy like me can only write in that voice. And I know it's a bit of a tangent to the topic tonight, but related to it, I'm curious whether you have feedback from the library there.
Sonia, I get, David, is the question basically, have you been asked to remove books where the voice does not match up with the author's gender and therefore that perspective? Is that what you're asking? No? oh, sorry. He doesn't have the mic.
To be honest, maybe it was a bit of a ramble. It was a number of thoughts that came to mind about the idea of self-censorship. I guess the question, if there is one to you, is just as an author might be challenged to say what they wanted to say without worrying about how will it fly out there, will I be attacked, even if it's my truth. Do you, in your work, find yourself regularly having to ask yourself that question and then dial back, reel back in what you believe professionally to actually be what you should be doing?
I don't know. For example, I sometimes wonder if I'm qualified to write about racism. You can listen to people and you can be sympathetic to them, but do you truly understand that and I think that is why we need to have more voices in literature and in the media.
I would also have a couple of observations about what you've said. I do, in terms of self-censorship, so remember in my opening remarks where I said every once in a while I'll read a book that, I maybe don't agree with. So I used to ride the bus and have my book every day. When I read a book that I maybe don't agree with, it might be an audiobook, so that people aren't looking at what I'm reading. No, but there are sometimes those moments of self-censorship that happens. That's a sort of flippant personal example. But you've talked about something in publishing that is really interesting. I mean, really there are 5 big international publishing houses left. And when competition becomes that concentrated, other things start to happen and start to drive the product. And that's a concern for me. So there was, and I don't have the media reference for it, but for example, a textbook publisher creating 3 different versions of history to see which one would sell in Florida. So, you know, it's just, you know, those sorts of things concern me, and that's about, you know, that concentration of the market, that sense of competition, and the other things start driving what's happening. Genuinely and generally, I feel that who we are is expressed, just like a record, an original archival record, should never be changed or expunged because it is the representation. I think who we are is also, even though it's art and it gets edited, who we are is expressed in publishing. And so, you know, I like the truest possible representation of, you know, whatever that art is. I'm talking more about fiction here than nonfiction. I think there's a different role for editing in those. But that is, you know, who we are is going to be very beautiful and very ugly at different times. And I think we owe it, that we do no favors by trying to, you know, change that record.
Do we have other audio? Oh, there we go. Lisa, go ahead.
Hi, my name's Lisa, and I was just looking at the Moms for Liberty website, and it says basically that like their main thing they're saying is they're defending the rights of parents. And I've noticed in the last couple of months anyway, especially the last few weeks, something like that happening in Canada. Like we had this big march that happened across Canada, and they were really, really on, at least in the news, at the protests, saying parental rights, you know. And I wonder, first of all, it seems like it's a correlation between that, and it's like a strategy. And do you think that have you seen that strategy about parental rights coming to the public libraries? Does it worry you at all that people would come in with that approach?
So I'm going to say no. So a public library, there's a different framework around responsibility for children. In a school, there's a very different sort of framework around being responsible for kids than there is in a public library. We're not a school and we're not a daycare. And we're very clear that children under a certain age should be accompanied by an adult. And that's why there's no restriction in terms of what section of the library, you know, kids might choose to go to. And so when, if someone were to approach about those rights, there are many things and that we have in place where, you know, we encourage, the library is a lovely family activity, first of all. There are privacy screens on our computers. There are kids, you know, you have to log in with a children's card in the children's computer. Like there are lots of things, different controls that we put in place. Parents can choose to, you know, limit what's on their kid's library card in terms of logging onto the internet, for example. So there are some of those things that give some choice, but it's just really important to remember that we don't have that same responsibility as a school does, for example, towards children, and there is still, you know, that role for choice, and I think. Not that I, you know, that makes it sound that I, like I'm sympathetic to that movement in terms of schools, and I would defend the right of schools to develop their professional curriculum and to use their professional collection development for their libraries in the same way. But it is important to understand that in terms of relating to children, a public library has a bit of a different legal context there.
Sonia? What's the age under which a young person must be accompanied by an adult in OPO?
Is it 12? 12.
Thank you, Ottawa Public Library. You guys are great. Love you. Love your work. I'm kind of concerned on like the other sense. So we're talking about like censorship, but I also have so like the parental rights, Moms for Liberty, like right now, PragerU is starting to be in schools. I don't know if you're aware of what PragerU is, but it's literally just a far-right educational curriculum for children. So there's currently far-right books being written, and I don't want them in our libraries. I don't want, like, so for example, in the United States, there's a lot of like big oil books are there, like literally like, petroleum is great, everything is petroleum, never ever question the oil and gas company. And like these are books that are currently in school libraries in the United States. And it's like, so I'm worried that more like, while they are currently like, basically we're fighting over censorship, but they're also just creating more and more content to muddy the waters further. So I understand and appreciate we need the balance, be able to see both sides of an issue, but once a book is that that devious, it's basically pure propaganda, but like marketed for children. That's kind of like my concern now too, like past the censorship. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure that a book that says petroleum is good and believe everything, it would meet our selection or collection development criteria. I can't speak to the content that you're talking about because I'm not familiar with it. But that is, again, I'll just go back to our collection development policy and why that's important in how we select and develop the collections.
Do you want
Just one, I would say in general that librarians, in general, are more likely to be progressive and democratic than they are on the other end of the political spectrum. But as Sonia has mentioned, what we strive to do is to have books representative of any legitimate or point of view about which our readers want to inquire. So I put together a list of 15 or 20 books by prominent conservative spokespeople, politicians, commentators, think tankers, and so forth. There were popular books among their readers, and I went through, and the library had every single one of them. So I might read one of those books and say, I disagree with this. This person is almost dangerous, but it was a thoughtful and legitimate statement of a point of view from a person who had devoted time and thought, and it should be in the library.
Yeah, go ahead.
There has been some chat on the YouTube chat, and there is a question/comment that I wanted to share. This says, we read Cass, The Origins of Our Discontents at the Unitarian Fellowship of London, which was banned, the book was banned in certain areas of the US. I assume that the complaint was based on retelling history by a minority. I don't know if that's it sounds like it's a comment of, does anybody know whether it was based on that? Do any of you have any thoughts on that?
No.
Okay.
Way to read banned books, I guess. Yeah. Yeah, I think, and we're just about at time, I think, here, so we can maybe wrap up. But to the last question as well, I wonder if folks want to add to, these issues are, of course, complex, and sometimes they get simplified to the point of saying that, well, it's, peer review is censorship, right? Where expert opinion is somehow censorship. And yet there is, I think, space in the democratic society for discernment. There has to be some degree of discernment about what goes into a public collection, about what's published in an academic journal, about labeling things as misinformation or disinformation. Those are also important things that aren't precluded by, I would argue, intellectual freedom. But are there any kind of, comments on that? Of course, there are limits within the realm of hate speech, but there are also limits in terms of how we assess works on a kind of merit of legitimacy around certain intellectual rigor and other qualifications.
Yeah, I would say, publishers, going back to the comment earlier, are interested in selling books. And so that popular fiction, nonfiction is not usually going to start tapping up against that bar of hate literature. Where you see that, so if you look at the last few convictions for hate literature in Canada, it was largely self-published materials, pamphleteering, and that type of publishing, and that's just not something that we tend to collect. So that popular fiction, nonfiction is going to be a bit of a middling force there. So, yeah.
All right. It is 9 o'clock, so I suppose I'll leave it to the panelists. If you have any final thoughts or perhaps any final calls to action about the support of intellectual freedom, public libraries, what have you, this is your moment. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to reflect that hosting conversations like this is really key. So I very much appreciate the opportunity to be here and to be with my fellow panelists, because I think this is central to having the discussion and central to exercising that democratic right. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Last Sunday, Jan and I were at home, and Jan looked up and said, "Mick, have you heard of a group called Stop Moms for Liberty?" I said, "No." And she said, "Well, it was a group that apparently is a counterforce to Moms for Liberty, and they operate on the same principle of grassroots organization, county level, local level chapters, whose purpose, their principles are to resist and counteract the principles from Moms for Liberty." So one of my projects for the rest of the week is to find out as much as I can about this group and see if we have one nearby. But the point is that the strength of the book banning movement has been, as we've seen, at the local level. So maybe that's where pushback can come from.
And I'm just grateful to live in Ottawa, where the public library is such a forward-thinking policy and is so transparent about it. So that's all I have to add.
All right, great note to end on. Thanks to the Ottawa Public Library and to all of our wonderful panelists. And thank you to all of you for being here. Coffee? There is, I believe, coffee. I assume also some decaf and snacks over there. So go get that and chat. Thanks.
Thank you.
It was a pretty good panel, wasn't it?
Thank you. Great. Thank you.